All right, so we're going to talk about the color we're going to be using for the still life. So this is the first time now that you guys are using color in a very real way. Before you were just doing either the monochromatic palette, or you were doing the achromatic palette, or you were doing the complementary color scheme. Here we've got our whole palette laid out. I don't have every color on here, but I have the ability to make a lot of colors from what I have on my palette right now. And it's laid out in a very logical way. So it's kind of like what you learned in your design class, right? So we've got our yellow at the top, and then we're going to go to our greens, and then blue, and then we've got our reds. We're going to have an orange here. We're going to have another green here. And we'll talk about why we have why we have two yellows and basically two reds going on. Then up at the top, we've got our neutrals. So we've got yellow ochre, and we've got burnt sienna, which is going to be important in the still life that we're going to be using, that I'm going to be painting today. And then we have the raw umber that we used before, and then the white. Notice I don't have any black on the palette right now. It may end up being in there, but for right now, it's not really necessary. And we'll talk about ways of making a black that I think are more conducive to the kind of painting that you're going to be doing today. Okay. Now, the two yellows, as you notice, one looks brighter than the other one. This one is also cooler. So you hear about these terms, warm versus cool, all the time. And you have your warm colors and your cool colors. Yellow is generally considered a warm color. Red's a warm color. Blue is a cool color. Green is a cool color. So what the cool colors are, it basically means the presence of blue, or at least the appearance of blue. Like if you look at these two reds, you'll see that this is a violet, actually, a red violet, and this is a cadmium red light. And this one is way warmer than that one. This is way cooler. The thing that you need to understand about the warmth versus the cool is when you're mixing color, you want to make sure that you're using a warm red to make an orange as opposed to a cool red to make an orange. If you use a cool red to make an orange, mixing the red with the yellow, then you're going to get something that's kind of brown, okay? And you also, the same thing is going to happen when you're making a violet. With the violet, you want to use the cool red to make a violet. If you use the warm red to make the violet, again, you're going to get something that's kind of brown. Now, these two yellows are going to be important, and I found that out the hard way, actually, because there was a point in time where I had a lot of cadmium yellow lemon for some reason, and I didn't have my cadmium yellow light, and I was too cheap to go out and buy it, so I was using that as a substitute for that. It really is not a substitute for that, so you want to be careful. Anything that you're going to be mixing with red, you're going to want to use this, okay? Any kind of green that you're going to be making, usually it's going to be this, the cadmium yellow lemon, because it seems to have a little bit of green in it already. Okay, so I'll show you how that's going to work exactly right now, as a matter of fact. So we're going to make a green. You're going to see that the two greens here, that's a very, very vivid green. That's a permanent bright green. It's not something that you would actually have in the still life. Most likely you're not going to need this color to paint. Like we have a very bright green apple in that still life. You're probably not using this. And phthalo green, also a very unnatural looking green. I think I mentioned to the class earlier in the semester that the one thing that I noticed when I saw the show for at the Getty of Manet was that there was this explosion of phthalo green that he was using, because that was a fairly recent invention in the time of the Impressionists. So he was really making use of that green, but it is sort of an unnatural looking green. It's very vivid, but it's hard to make it look natural. So when we're dealing with an organic object like the apple is, we're going to want to make our own green. So I'm going to take a little bit of the blue. This is the ultramarine blue. And you can have two blues as well, like a cerulean blue could work. Cobalt blue could work. The ultramarine blue is a little bit more violet, so it's going to make a duller looking green. But a duller looking green is actually not too much of a bad thing right now. So we're going to take that and we're going to mix this together. going to show you over here on the white paper what this is going to look like. So you can see it's a very sort of dull, almost olive green. Now let's do the same thing. Let's make a green using, or a more yellow green using the phthalo green. Let's first see what phthalo green by itself looks like. So you can see it's relatively dark, also kind of blue. And then here's a green we've made using the cadmium lemon and that phthalo green. And you can see that that is a lot brighter by far than that. Okay. And then the bright permanent green straight from the tube. And that seems even brighter. The reason for that, and the reason we talk about with color mixing, you learned in your design class that you've got your three primary colors, your red, your yellow, your blue, and that you can make all the colors with the three primary colors. It's not exactly true. And what happens is, if that were the case, then they'd only be selling 3 tubes of paint at the store, right? That you could just mix them up and make everything. But so why would you need to buy a green? Well, the reason you need to buy a green is because anytime you mix color, even something like yellow and blue, which are very saturated colors, you mute the color. That happens all the time. And so this is actually manufactured. It's not a mixture of the paint. It's a mixture of the actual chemicals that they use to make the paint. So it's going to be less muted than it would any color that you mix. But most of the time, like I said, you're going to need to have a somewhat muted or something a little bit more natural. You can see that those colors don't really look natural. They're almost fluorescent. Now I'm going to make a more of a yellow green now, which for our apple, the green apple is kind of a yellow green. So still mixing the cad lemon yellow with the ultramarine. And that's getting to be a pretty good apple color. Still a little bit on the dull side, but if we feel like we need to spike that up a little bit, we can add a little bit of the phthalo green to it to punch it up. That's a lot of the phthalo green. We're going to need to add a little bit more yellow now. Okay, so you can see the difference between all these different greens. Now there's also, we talked about when we were doing the complementary color painting, the idea of muting your color by adding a complement, creating tones. So anytime you have something that's overly saturated, then you can perhaps knock it down by adding a little bit of the red to it. So we could take something like this, it's really saturated, and we can add just a little bit of the red. And that makes it more muted. So it was one of those, I don't remember which one it was. It was one of these greens. And now you can see the difference by adding a little bit of red, how that makes it a little bit more neutral, right? Okay, so violets. So let's make a violet. We're going to take our ultramarine blue. I don't have any violet in my still life. I'm not going to need this. With the possibility of perhaps needing to make a shadow, but we'll see. So there we have a violet that we've mixed with our ultramarine blue. So here I'm going to show you what ultramarine blue looks like. Ultramarine blue is relatively dark. If we wanted to lighten that up, we can add a little bit of white. Adding white also mutes the color, so the color is not as saturated when you're adding white to it, or gray, or anything else, anytime you're mixing anything to it. So there you can see that's the blue with that little bit of white added to it. And you can kind of see there's a violet cast to that blue. Wish I had another blue to show you. Now making a red, for the red apple, we're going to need to have a cooler red to start. This red would be too warm. This is the cadmium red light. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the cadmium red light and we're going to mix it. You're gonna, if you probably have alizarin crimson, so you're gonna either be using the alizarin crimson or you're gonna be using this, the cadmium, or the red violet. So you can see that this red now, which is a combination of the cool red and the warm red, is more what you would expect as far as a red goes. Like when you picture the color red. You're probably thinking something more like this than something like this, which this is the cadmium red light. Cadmium red light appears, like a red orange to people a lot of times. Then let's see what the red violet looks like by itself. You also notice that there is some difference in opacity, transparency. In the color. This is definitely a very transparent color. Okay, now to make an orange, you definitely want to use the cadmium yellow light. Some of you might have cadmium orange that you purchased already, and that's fine, as opposed to mixing it up. But this is still going to make a pretty good orange. So that's kind of a red orange. So we're going to add a little bit more yellow to it. Now I may or may not be using orange in painting the apple, and we're going to I'll talk about why when we get to that step, but for right now, just to really show you how to arrive at that color. So you can see there, that's closer to an orange, and then if we want a yellow orange, we're just going to have to add more yellow to it. What else do I need to let you know? Well, the painting itself, we're going to be moving from the cooler colors to the warmer colors, okay? So with the red apple, we're going to have the cooler red to start. It might be that red, but it could even be that red. And then we're going to get progressively warmer and progressively lighter. So we are going to be mixing our color with white to get lighter versions. But this has to go on top of the darker color first. So with the oil painting, you're going to be painting light over dark, okay? The other thing that you're going to need to remember is there's going to be times where you're looking at your still life and it looks to you like there's a white highlight on that still life. Never do that. Never make the still life. Never add a white highlight on top of the color, just straight white. You want to have a little bit, tiny, tiny, tiny bit of the color in there. So you can see as we're getting progressively lighter now by adding more and more white to it. Oh yeah, I remember the one other thing I wanted to show you, since we don't have black, right? So the way that we can make a black, something that's going to appear black, is I'm going to take some of the ultramarine blue and some of my raw umber. Burnt umber will work as well. Talking about warm and cool, by the way, that's burnt sienna. Burnt sienna is a warmer brown than the umbers are. The umbers are cooler browns. So when you see this on the paper, you're going to see that it does look like a black. That looks pretty black. I can actually show you what a black looks like next to it. This ivory black that I just squeezed out there. And it's going to appear darker for sure. So you can see the difference. Still, if you saw that without that next to it, you would assume that was a black, okay? Now the reason why I like this as opposed to that when I'm painting is that this is going to mix with color a lot better. Black has a tendency to pollute color, so that the black just makes everything look wrong, okay? So if we can avoid putting it in there, it's a good idea to avoid putting it in there. I always talk about black as being like black pepper. It's something that maybe you need a little bit of it to spice something up, but you don't want to have it permeate what it is you're doing. If you were cooking, you don't want to have a bunch of black pepper because it makes it inedible. So it's just like that. So if there might be like a little point of shadow on the stem of the apple that maybe I want to punch it up with that, but I don't think I would need to do that. I think that would probably be fine. That would work to do that. Okay, so that's color mixing. And we will see how we're going to use these colors in the actual still life. You'll notice that when I arranged my palette, I had the colors arrayed at the top and on the side, and I left all this empty, right? So this is why you have a large palette, so that you have this area to mix the colors in, okay? And then you always know, like, there are some people that are very anal about this, but the good thing about laying out your palette the same way every time is that when you're painting, you don't even have to look at your palette. You pretty much know where everything is going to go, and it just speeds things up a lot. But there are certain times, even when I'm dealing with values, I still have a logic to how I'm laying my values out, like what you saw with the umber. I started with the light and went my way darker. So the same thing would happen with monochromatic or the complementary color scheme. But this is a full palette for the most part, so this is, how you would be dealing with that. And the other thing that you'll notice is that it wasn't like a ton of paint I was mixing up. Now, obviously, I'm going to need more green than what I have. This was just for the color demonstration, but you're not going to need too much more paint than what we have out here. In fact, you're probably going to end up throwing some of this away. I get this question all the time from students. They're like, well, how can I save this now that I've mixed this color up? And I do know there are certain painting instructors that they do have their students mix up a lot of paint, and then they actually have them buy the empty tubes and then fill the empty tubes with the colors they mixed up. What I find is if it's good if you can keep your color recipe simple, the simpler the better, and also take notes when you're mixing colors up to remember how you got to something. Like you could do something like this where you laid everything out and wrote down what it was. But there are ways of saving oil paint if you mix up a lot of colors. One of the ways to do it is that you take a baby food jar and you take the color that you mixed up and you put it in the baby food jar, and then on top of that you pour distilled water. And the distilled water keeps the air from getting to the paint. Oil paint doesn't dry in that it's not evaporating like acrylic paint does. It's oxidizing. Okay, so if you keep oxygen away from the paint, then it won't ever dry. Which is why you can have tubes of paint that are really, really old, and as long as they're sealed, they should last a long time. I've got tubes of paint that are probably older than some of you, okay, and they still work. So as long as the paint is workable, it's gonna last. All right, so it's been pointed out to me that I didn't really do anything with these. Okay, so let's talk about the yellows for a minute. So we've got, this is the cadmium yellow light, and so we'll put this down, and then you're going to see it next to the the yellow ochre. So this is yellow ochre without anything mixed in it, sort of a golden color. A lot more natural, right? Certainly not vivid. This is going to come up, and I believe the fabric I have for the still life, if you had a squash or something, it might come up in that. The gourds that I always use in my still lifes for my drawing class, it would be used for that. Here's our burnt sienna. So this reddish brown versus the umber, which is a very dark brown. And I thought I had, I did have, I didn't bring it, my burnt umber to show you the difference in that. But anyway, so the other thing that we talked about was like using the wrong yellow to mix, say the orange, or the wrong red to mix the violet. So let's see what that would actually look like. Taking my ultramarine blue, and instead of using the phthalo, I think it was a phthalo violet, we'll use the cadmium red light. So this should be purple, right? But when you see it next to the actual violet, it looks like a brown. It looks browner than the brown, right? So obviously you might need a color like that, but like for maybe a shadow or something, but it's not something that you're going to want to use if you're trying to mix the violet. So remember, we got the violet by mixing up phthalo violet and ultramarine blue, and so I'm going to add a little bit of white to it so you can see what that. So that's a nice purple. We'll see the same. So you can see how gray that looks compared to that, right? So that's why you want to be aware of what kinds of yellow you're dealing with, what kind of blue you're dealing with, what kind of red you're dealing with in color mixing. Okay, so color mixing, and we will work on the still life right now.